Welcome to this edition of Real World White Collar Law. I'm Seth Berenzweig from the law firm of Berenzweig, Leonard, here in our BL Media studios in beautiful Tysons, Virginia, here with my colleague David Deitch. David, how are you doing today?
Doing well, Seth. Glad to be back from a long holiday weekend and ready to roll into the summer.
Fantastic. Well, we're here today to talk about a case that is obviously been covered coast to coast and probably all over the world. And it is the criminal indictment in New York of the Trump Organization and a gentleman by the name of Alen Weisselberg. I'd like to say at the outset that a lot of the coverage with regard to this case has been focusing on the politics. We are not here to discuss politics. We are here to take a different angle. What we want to do is we want to peel back the layers of the indictment, and we want to talk about it simply from a corporate and business law perspective in terms of what is happening, what are the basic elements and lessons learned. So we're not going to be arguing the R's versus the D's today, but we're really going to be getting into the nuts and bolts because there's some practical takeaways and some observations on a case that's really getting a lot of national media attention. So David, give us some background, and what is this indictment all about?
Well, the indictment, generally speaking, is about taxes.
All right.
And about how income was reported by the Trump Organization, particularly to Mr. Weisselberg, who was the chief financial officer there. And it really breaks down into two pieces. Part of the indictment talks about different pieces of compensation that Mr. Weisselberg got, but this isn't compensation like your biweekly paycheck, which he got as well. Mm-hmm. This is compensation that sometimes can be argued about as fringe benefits when it's small things, but here we were talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we're talking about apartments that were given without rent, cars that were leased,
Right.
other items that were purchased for Mr. Weisselberg and for his family. And there's a whole series of them that are described in the indictment that were received but were not reported as compensation that was paid to Mr. Weisselberg.
Okay.
The other, if I can just finish,
Sure,
the other part is the way in which some of that compensation was reported by the Trump Organization, namely
Right.
that instead of putting it on Mr. Weisselberg's W-2 form to the IRS, which reports the compensation that he received as an employee, other Trump org subsidiaries basically reported it as income to him as an independent contractor using a Form 1099 that some of us may have gotten if we ever did work separately for an organization where we weren't an employee. And that has certain consequences both for the way the company can treat that money and the way Mr. Weisselberg was able to treat it.
So my understanding from reading it all, if you put the money at issue in the aggregate, according to the government, it's $1.76 million. Does that sound about right?
That's right, and the taxes at issue came to something like $500,000 or $600,000.
Okay, so again, not a political conversation, but just in terms of from a white collar and from a corporate standpoint, we keep hearing this is a case about fringe benefits. This is not a criminal case. This should be just about fringe benefits. According to the indictment, and again, these are based on allegations as we sit here today. These are not facts. These are asserted allegations. What is the government saying here? What, if at all, is the concern about why the government believes that this belongs in a criminal venue?
Well, what the government is alleging is that this was a scheme to defraud the government of tax revenue.
Okay.
In other words, these were intentional acts by Mr. Weisselberg, by the Trump Organization, to hide income. And if you drew a spectrum of tax problems,
Right.
we're, again, assuming these allegations are true and are proven with the government's burden at a trial.
It's their burden.
Assuming they're true and proven, this is at one far end of that spectrum.
Right.
This is an accusation that they intentionally hid this money.
Okay.
You know, at the other end of the spectrum are people who are completely transparent and disclose everything. Right. And the problem and the place where people really need help sometimes is right in the middle. People who are trying to do tax avoidance, which is perfectly legal and appropriate if done by the rules,
Right.
but may not know exactly what the rules are and how to color within the lines.
Yeah, tax avoidance is legal. Tax dodging with bad intent is not legal, it's criminal, right? So the government's coming in and they're saying these are not legitimate strategies. This was done with a years-long systemic intention of committing criminal tax fraud. Is that the high-level essence of what the government is asserting here?
No, that's exactly right. This is
Okay.
not someone who had some small benefit they received from an employer, and at some point the IRS audited them and determined they should not have claimed that as a credit or a deduction.
Right. Okay, so we're not quibbling about what a car lease should look like. We're talking about a big picture. And the reason why Alen Weisselberg is at the center of this, and again, we can have a political conversation offline, but I really have no interest in doing that here. Alen Weisselberg is important because he is the CFO of the Trump Organization, and he is the person who is at the tip of the iceberg in terms of having and implementing the financial and fiscal policies of putting all of this together and implementing it, and that he also happens to have involved in the allegations alleged benefits to other members of his family. Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Well, there was one family member who's alleged to have had a Manhattan apartment and never paid rent.
His son.
The Trump Organization provided cars, one for Mr. Weisselberg, one for his wife.
Right.
The company also paid tuition for, I believe it was Mr. Weisselberg's grandchildren.
Right, right. So the son's name is Barry. Barry has worked within the Trump Organization. There are allegations with regard to Barry, unfortunately for Barry and his dad. Jennifer Weisselberg, who is the ex-wife of Barry, has been quite vocal with the prosecutor's office. We're not going to talk about what she's done in the media, but with the prosecutor's office providing a litany of documents that have become a part of the case. One of the things that's also of note is that the Trump Organization is, generally speaking, a small business organization. It is a small business. We're very familiar here with other small businesses in Washington, D.C. So let's just say, for example, that a small business can be an organization that has 25 or less people. Sometimes small businesses handle certain aspects of the business organization on their own without hiring outside objective third-party consultants. Who ran the payroll that was the engine for a lot of the facts that are at issue in this case?
Yeah, well, according to the indictment, Mr. Weisselberg had supervision over the payroll internally in the Trump Organization, but it was run, rather than running it through one of these big third-party payroll companies that
Like
you see.
Paychecks or something like that. Yeah.
Instead, it was run by a company called Trump Payroll.
Okay. So perhaps a bit of a red flag in terms of what the prosecutor's office might have been looking at. If we're looking at this, David, from a business standpoint, from a corporate standpoint, and if we wanted to look at it by just taking off our political glasses, by really having a real sober-eyed look at this, are there any cautionary tales or lessons that you believe can be learned by small businesses by taking a look at this very renowned case?
Well, I think the umbrella observation we can make is that the tax laws are complicated and important. There are times when companies are handling a lot of money and are providing compensation to their employees, some of whom may be family members or friends.
Sure.
And they want to reward those families and friends in the same way that they would reward any good employee. And they just have to take care about how they do it so that they report things properly and they don't get tangled up in one of these messes.
And they're also allowed to do that in a way, by the way, where they can blend in a consideration of how to legitimately avoid paying taxes. Our duty as Americans and as people who are operating a business in the United States is not to pay the maximum amount of taxes, and I don't think that has anything to do with this case. But one of the things that struck me in reading the indictment, without getting too lost in the weeds, is that a lot of these things are what I would call unforced errors. So, for example, without laying it out by name, there was a reference to other individuals that have senior leadership roles in the business organization, which by process of elimination is probably Mr. Trump's children, principally, for example, Ivanka Trump, who, although classified as an employee / director of the organization, also got paid as a 1099 independent contractor or consultant. And that raised a red flag because a question arises, how can you be both at the same time? You can't be a zebra and an elephant at the same time, right? You can't be pregnant or not pregnant. And as the indictment points out, if someone just randomly says that they want to take a part of their income and they want to just slice it off and put it in as a 1099 contractor, that allows them to shelter a lot of that money through a KEO plan, as well as maybe being able to write some of that money off against other things. So one of the examples of a potential lesson learned is employee classification. What are some other specific examples of what, if anything, did you see in the indictment where it might have led to a thought of that's an example of an unforced error that business leaders today might be able to take a lesson in?
Well, some of the benefits that we're being provided seem to be so far afield from anything relating to the business.
So, for example,
that there really is no straight-faced argument that these are fringe benefits that relate to employment. For example, paying the tuition of Mr. Weisselberg's grandchildren, or even perhaps a better example, the bonuses that Mr. Weisselberg was providing to employees on his own, that provided, or rather the holiday bonuses that he was providing, were given to him by the money was given to another Trump Organization employee who cashed the check, took the cash, and gave the cash to Mr. Weisselberg.
Right.
And again, this is the accusation, the allegation.
Yeah. Yet to be proven.
But if that's true, that seems so far beyond the pale of the way a business would act if it was trying to be careful and be compliant with the laws. And I liked your use of the sports metaphor of an unforced error, because what I was thinking also was that, as in sports, there are rules, and you play by the rules.
Right.
And if you break the rules, you might get caught breaking the rules. And you can argue sometimes that the rules allow things that you don't like, and maybe over time the rules change. But part of keeping safe to get back to kind of our lessons learned, part of keeping safe as a business is knowing what those rules are and keeping with those rules.
I'll offer another one, because I think that this indictment has a lot of areas with respect to a cautionary tale. Providing a car for people who are senior leaders at the company. There's nothing wrong with a company providing a company-furnished vehicle for an officer or a director of a company. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. They didn't do that. First, they didn't acquire or purchase a vehicle. They leased it. All they had to do was provide the vehicle under another kind of a very basic recognized transaction that is completely permitted by the IRS. They didn't do that. Also, not only, and again, these are just allegations, it's the government's burden beyond a reasonable doubt to be able to prove it, but that not only did Alen get a car leased for himself, but then they also gave one to his wife. And the wife seems to have taken no real role in the operations of the Trump Organization business either. Going back to the issue of misclassifications, and that apparently is something that may have applied, for example, to Ivanka. Misclassification is an issue that can really rattlesnake a business beyond or in addition to criminal implications. So, for example, here in Virginia, effective July 1, there is a new statute in Virginia that provides new penalties to companies that misclassify somebody in the way that allegedly Ivanka Trump was misclassified. If you take a W-2 employee and you misclassify them as a 1099 contractor, inadvertently or purposefully, there are new civil money penalties that apply for that. The point being that I think it's a mistake for someone to look at this story and just start screaming about political witch hunts. That conversation can happen all day. There are points and counterpoints to be made on that, and I respect those conversations completely. But this is a real business. This is a real indictment. This is a real criminal prosecution. Do you think that this is going to go to trial? We have all of this on the table. What's your prediction in terms of where do you think this is going to go? And do you think that the defendants have any criminal exposure in this case?
Yeah. Well, look, the elephant in the room that we haven't really talked about is, why are they pursuing this case? Why are prosecutors pursuing it? Mm-hmm. And if we look at what's reported in the media for greater context, the suspicion has always been that they're trying to put pressure on Mr. Weisselberg to cooperate. in respect to other investigations involving the Trump organization.
Right.
And that may or may not be true. As a statistical matter, very few cases go to trial in the federal system. In part by design, by the way the Justice Department brings cases, but that doesn't tell you for each individual case whether it's going to go to trial or not. From what I understand from what's reported in the media, this is a difficult case to defend. Because,
why is that?
Well, the judge isn't going to want to hear about whether this is a politically motivated prosecution.
That's not a legal defense, right?
It's not a legal defense. There is, in a very rare instance, there can be a defense of selective prosecution. This isn't it. This just isn't it. Because this is based on documents.
Right.
This is not some discretionary judgment that was made. I've seen references to at least one article by a professor at NYU who specializes in tax who talks about this isn't an instance where most people who have fringe benefit issues with the IRS get civil penalties, but here they decided to prosecute. This is of a sufficient magnitude that it really, in any instance, would have been brought as a criminal case, particularly because not only does it involve a very large amount of money, and not only were some of the decisions that were made really appear to be beyond the pale of some discretionary judgment, but there's a transparency problem because apparently, again, as reported and as alleged in the indictment, they were keeping separate sets of books.
Right.
So that the Trump organization knew what the total compensation was to Mr. Weisselberg, but was telling the IRS something different.
And they were operating it allegedly within their own self-crafted payroll network that they were then just, having it be kind of an inside job. Again, those are just part of the allegations. Some of the aspects of the cautionary tale for people, business leaders, to be able to draw from this is please reflect on how easy it is to hire independent third-party consultants to help with this. Example, payroll. You can hire Paychecks. In Virginia and the surrounding areas, you can hire Dominion Payroll. If someone contacted Dominion or Paychecks and said, I want to hire my director and have her be an employee, but I also want to take some of the money and I want to throw it over to a 1099, someone's going to say, oh, really? How do you plan to do that? They have basic planning. They have assistants. They're very cost effective. Their administrative costs for running each of the payrolls is fairly reasonable. I think that you should also have legal counsel, corporate legal counsel, be able to draft certain kinds of documents, employment agreements, resolutions, to be able to substantiate and document the reasons why the company is taking certain decisions. And that's going to be able to provide some kind of a basis that the company can go back and rely upon to be able to show investigators and say, this was how we handled it in the regular and ordinary course of business, not just because we were trying to throw a Hail Mary, trying to figure out how we can get cute with tax.
I think the other aspect of that is that businesses have to realize that this is indeed a cautionary tale.
Right.
It's very easy to look at this and say, well, that's them, that's not me.
Right.
That's not what we do.
Right.
And even if you are a small business and you would never make those kinds of judgments, there are judgments you can make that can be called into question. Mm-hmm. And it's very easy to find yourself kind of in that gray area in the middle where you are facing problems.
Yes.
Whether it's criminal problems or civil audits or other kinds of tax problems, and you just don't want to be there. And it's always cheaper and better to fix things on the front end than to fix them on the back end.
Compliance is much less expensive than defending yourself in the long run, right?
Exactly.
So, well, David, in wrapping this up, what is your prediction in terms of where you think this case is going to go? I don't believe that Weisselberg's going to take a plea because he's an older gentleman. He has no priors. He's probably being told by his attorneys that the likelihood of any significant incarceration is somewhere between slim and none, and Slim probably already left town. What's your prediction on what's going to happen here?
Well, I think your judgment's probably right. I don't know specifically what the judge who has that case would do. Mm-hmm. And there are instances where judges just are offended. And certainly when you calculate, if you sit down with the U.S. sentencing guidelines with these crimes that are, I'm sorry, not the U.S. sentencing guidelines, but the state guidelines, and look at the way that they're calculated, they may recommend a jail sentence. But you're right that given his age, given the circumstances, he's unlikely to face that. So what happens? I don't know. Some of this is so wrapped up in his relationship with the company and his relationship with Mr. Trump
and the family
that it's very hard to predict that way, and it's almost more a product of those relationships than anything about the law.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think this is a very intricate case. There are a lot of complicated relationships here on many levels. Mr. Weisselberg's been with the company and the organization for decades. I predict that although Alen Weisselberg will not feel a significant degree of pressure from the current state of affairs, the prosecutors are going to lean on his son, Barry. And when the pressure on Barry is going to be asserted, you're going to have kind of what I would call a Mike Flynn effect, which is that dad is going to feel more pressure to protect son, and that might lead to a different dynamic. But I don't think that that's something that's going to happen until later this fall. David, great conversation. I think that we got into a layer of depth and analysis on this that's just not being covered by mainstream media. So I really appreciate you helping us break all of this nationally renowned case down for us today.
Well, it was a pleasure.